Welcome back to the Dershow. Interesting things happened in the last 4 or 5 days since we were last on the podcast. People say, well, Trump doesn't have any checks and balances. He has a mandate. He got the popular vote. He got the electoral vote. He can do what he wants to do. The Supreme Court, maybe they can check him, but maybe they can't. What they fail to realize is that there are lots of checks and balances out there that are not part of our Constitution. Take, for example, the stock market. Stock market has gone down dramatically since President Trump announced his program on tariffs, Canada and Mexico and other countries. That's a kind of check and balance on what he can do and what he can't do. President announced today that maybe there'll be a recession this year. Well, recessions impact electoral politics, although we're a year and a half away from the next election. Nonetheless, the stock market, has a check and balance impact. The European community, the way it gathered around Zelensky after the Oval Office confrontation, and that is also a type of check and balance. President Trump has tremendous influence outside of the country, some positive, some negative. For example, he has definitely impacted the Canadian prime ministership election. What happened is a relative unknown named Mark Carney, never held elective office. He's an economist, decided to run for essentially prime minister, temporary prime minister, because Trudeau is leaving as head of the Labour Party, and that party is has the majority at the moment. There'll be elections soon. But as a result of the tariffs, Carney got 86% of the votes among the Labour, because he was running against Trump. And a month ago, it looked like the Conservatives were a shoo-in to win the Canadian election. But now the Canadian candidate who's running against Carney is being labeled as a pro-Trump supporter of tariffs. He's not. But, the election is coming down to, are you for Trump or are you against Trump? So, Trump may have influenced the outcome of the Canadian election against the interests of the United States inadvertently. So let's understand that in the world in which we live, no one's above not only the law, but no one's above the stock market. No one's above events that are occurring in other parts of the world. Another area that serves as something of a check, less, but something of a check on incumbent presidents, is the academy. Universities, because universities have an enormous number of students and faculty, some of them quite influential. But President Trump has decided to fight back against the universities, and that's the subject for today's show. There are two issues that I want to discuss. Number one, the decision that the Trump administration made to claw back $400 million worth of contracts and grants and other government subsidies to one school, Columbia University. Of course, Columbia is one of the worst schools when it comes to anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-Western values by students and many faculty members, and lack of courage by the administration. So that's one way of fighting back. We'll talk about that. I had written an article just hours, literally a day before, but it was published just hours before the Trump administration made its decision to cut back on Columbia, in which I had urged cutting back against Barnard, because Barnard is not a real school. It used to be a real school, but today students from Barnard just cross the street and take real courses at Columbia. And Barnard specializes in studies programs, feminist studies, gay studies, transgender studies. And the goals of these programs is not to teach or educate, but to propagandize. So Barnard was the best place to begin. The problem is, when you take back $400 million from Columbia, which is the funding institution, there's no such thing as Barnard, really. It's a subsidiary of Columbia in many ways. There's some independence. It has an independent endowment, stuff like that. It has independent contributors. I know because some friends of mine have stopped contributing to Barnard in recent years. But when you cut back from Columbia, you're cutting back not only from the propagandistic aspects of Columbia, but you're also cutting back on medical research. I have two relatives who are doctors at Columbia. They're, I don't know particularly if any of their research is being cut back on, but medical research, scientific research, environmental research, and research that does good for all Americans and indeed for the world is being cut back on because money is fungible. If you cut back on $400 million, it comes out of everything. Harvard just announced today, I literally got an email middle of the day today from the president of Harvard, I'm still on the faculty, saying we're cutting back, no more new hires. We're not hiring new people. Some of that's good. I hope they don't hire more people from, DEI. They ought to fire everybody from diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies, but they're not going to hire anybody else. So it's an across the board slashing. So it's very hard to target precisely the evildoers, of which there are many at places like Harvard and Columbia and University of California. And the Trump administration has also argued that Columbia may be the first, but it ain't the last. There are going to be other cutbacks at other universities who've not done enough to combat anti-Semitism. Of course, radical anti-Israel people like Peter Beinart and the ACLU have come out and say, oh my God, this constrains free speech. No, it doesn't, or at least doesn't constrain the free speech of those who are the targets of this. They're not being targeted because of what they believe or what they have said. They're being targeted because of what they've done. Encampments, blockades of students, bursting into classes and preventing the teacher from exercising his free speech and academic right to teach. That's the people who are being influenced. And so I have an article that I wrote today in which I argue, look, there are free speech concerns on both sides. You can overreact. A university could, and perhaps cut back on the right of student protesters who protest against Israel. That would be the wrong thing to do. Students have the right peacefully to protest against Israel, to protest against the United States, to protest against gay rights, to protest anything. Of course, they never do protest against gay rights. They only protest against Israel and the United States. But they have the right to do that. What they have no right to do is occupy buildings, send people to the hospital, which they have done, break into classes and prevent the teacher from teaching, block access to students who are wearing Stars of David or a kippah on their head, and engage in intimidating and threatening and sometimes even violent activities. Those activities are not protected by freedom of speech. Let's remember, too, that Columbia is a private institution, so it's not technically constitutionally bound by the First Amendment, but it claims to operate in the spirit of the First Amendment. It also claims to operate on neutral principles of free speech, but that's total nonsense. Can you imagine Columbia University allowing Ku Klux Klan members to come in wearing sheets that mask their faces and call for the lynching of blacks or the raping of women? Of course, they would never allow that, but they do allow pro-Hamas people to wear masks and to call for the murder of Jews and the raping of women, because when you support October 7th, as many of these students have done, the Al-Aqsa flood, that's not a euphemism. That's actually the name given by Hamas to the murder of 1,200 Jews, the rape of many, many women, and the kidnapping of 250 hostages, many of whom have been killed, some of whom had been raped as well when they were hostages and still are hostages. So let's remember there are speech concerns on all sides, and a university has an obligation to apply a single neutral standard, not a double standard. It can't say, you're entitled to call for genocide against the Jews, but you can't call for genocide against blacks. Well, of course, nobody is calling for genocide against blacks or genocide against Arabs. Nobody is supporting that or doing anything that suggests even support of that. Israel isn't engaged in genocide. If it wanted to engage in genocide, it could have destroyed the entire population of the Gaza Strip in hours. But instead, it has the lowest ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths of any country facing comparable wars in the history of warfare. And so, the claim of genocide is absurd. But, would a university permit? Remember, the president of Harvard was fired, and other presidents were fired because they couldn't answer a direct question. Does calling for the genocide against Jews violate the standards of speech? And of course, the answer should have been, well, calling for the genocide of anybody violates speech standards at our private universities. You can't call for the genocide of blacks. And if you can't call for the genocide of blacks, you can't call for the genocide of Jews. There's no difference. But President Gay of Harvard didn't have the courage to say that. She got fired for that and plagiarism and some other things, but presidents of other schools as well. And the woman who was largely responsible for those firings, Congresswoman Stefanik, is now our designated representative to the United Nations. She hasn't been confirmed yet because her vote in Congress is still important while there are some outstanding elections, but I've been in touch with her, and she's going to be a great representative to the United Nations. So the Columbia thing is difficult because it's not targeted. The $400 million is going to come from all over the university, including medical research, but it sends an important message. And Harvard, UCLA, and Berkeley, and others have already gotten the message. Let's see what they say. Let's see if they begin to apply a single standard and begin to not only allow, but encourage any kind of free speech protest. You can say whatever you want outside of the school. If you're a student, you can say it on the campus. You can hold up signs. You can't hold up signs in your classroom. You can't stop your teacher from teaching points of view which you disagree with, but you can protest. Your First Amendment rights haven't been abridged. I challenge Peter Meinhardt to show me one case where a student or a faculty member has been denied his right to express a point of view against Israel. But now comes the next question. What about if you're not a citizen of the United States? What about if you're here by sufferance of the country? What about if you are, like a man named Mahmoud Khalil, a former student at Columbia, now just living in a Columbia dorm, married to an American citizen who's 8 months pregnant, which makes it a sympathetic case, but he was one of the leaders of the encampment, of the trespassing, of many other actions, some of which may have been protected by the First Amendment, others of which were not protected by the First Amendment. And the United States government now, and the announcement came from the Secretary of State, but also from the White House, has arrested Mohammed Khalil and actually shipped him down to Louisiana, where he's being held in detention, subject to a deportation hearing. And so the question comes up, and it's a very complicated question. Wrote another op-ed about that today. I've written 2 op-eds today, a busy day. And I'm speaking tonight about my book, The 10 Big Israel Lies, which you can still get, by the way, for a couple of bucks on Amazon, or if you're a student or if you're a teacher and you want to get multiple copies of the book for your schools, you can get them free. So the book's free to students, free to faculty members, and a couple of bucks to the rest of you can afford it. And I hope you'll read it. I'm going to be talking about that tonight in a talk. But the question about whether or not this guy, Khalil, can be deported should be separated. The legal question, obviously, should be separated from the moral question. Khalil is a no-good-Nick. I mean, he's a terrible human being. He is a supporter of Hamas. He is an anti-Semite. He is anti-American. He's all the things we don't want in this country. But he's the holder of a green card. And as the holder of a green card and the husband of an American citizen, he has certain statutory rights. And those rights include the right not to be deported unless you've engaged in specified illegal activities. Now, among the specified illegal activities are being convicted of a crime of moral turpitude. Now, he hasn't been convicted of anything. The question is, did he commit any crimes of moral turpitude? If he blocked access to students, yes. If he blocked a class from being conducted, I think those are crimes. That would qualify. There's also a kind of catch-all provision that green card holders can be deported if their presence is against the national interests of the United States. Vague, probably might be held to be unconstitutional. Let's remember, too, there are two distinct, although they're overlapping, First Amendment rights. There's the constitutional right of a non-citizen, Khalil, to speak. That's a very limited right. He can speak. He can speak from outside the country. He can do it by Zoom. But does he have a right to speak in the United States? And the answer to that is probably no. He certainly has no constitutional right. Does he have a statutory right? Harder question. But then the next question is, do we, not me and you, because we don't want to hear Khalil speak, but do the radical anti-Semitic students, including some Jewish anti-Semites, of which there are plenty, but do the radical anti-American, anti-Jewish students, anti-Semitic students, anti-Israel students, they're citizens, do they have a right to hear him? Well, again, they have a right to hear him. They can hear him on Zoom. Do they have a right to hear him personally speak at Columbia? So those are interrelated, but somewhat separate rights. His right, minimal, because he's not a citizen. Their rights, more maximal, because they are citizens. And the court will have to delineate those rights and decide how to balance the rights of the Jewish students who are victimized by Khalil. Let's remember, Khalil is a villain. I mean, he has interfered with the rights of Jewish students to express their free speech rights by participating in demonstrations that have intimidated students. Students today don't wear Stars of David. I don't think they wear these ribbons, which I do, and they don't wear the kippah, the yarmulke, the head covering that Orthodox Jews wear. And then more and more, by the way, conservative and even secular Jews wear in order to show support for being Jewish. They don't want to be ashamed of their being Jewish. But Khalil was part of a process of intimidating Jews and making them frightened and keeping them home. And some of them have brought lawsuits as the result of Khalil and his followers. And he was one of the leaders. So the question is he guilty of conspiracy? Is he guilty of actual acts of intimidation? Government has a burden to demonstrate that. It's not a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt because it's not a criminal case. They have to show it by, I think it's clear and convincing evidence if you want to deport a green card holder by a lower standard than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But still, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. He's presumed, he's not presumed innocent because it's not a criminal case, but he's presumed non-deportable because the burden of proof is on those who would, in fact, deport him. So I think we're on the verge of seeing some really interesting constitutional issues. Obviously, the reason why the government immediately arrested him and sent him down to Louisiana was judge shopping. Of course it was judge shopping. You don't want a New York liberal judge to be ruling initially on his claimed right. You want a judge from rural Louisiana to make that initial ruling. Ultimately, the case will go first to the Circuit Court of Appeals, either Second Circuit or the Fifth Circuit, whichever Louisiana is in, Fifth or 11th, I don't remember offhand. But then it may very well get to the Supreme Court. We may be witnessing the route of a very important case to the Supreme Court, because this would be one of the first cases since the McCarthy period where the right to deport and the right of free speech, or the power to deport and the right of free speech, may have come into conflict. So I think we're going to see an important Supreme Court decision. And so remember the name Mahmoud Khalil. You should remember for a lot of reasons. He's a despicable human being. And if you see him, you should tell him what you think of him. But his name may go down in history if his case becomes the famous case of the United States versus Khalil on the limits of deportation and executive authority. So stay tuned. This is an interesting case. The Columbia case may also go to the courts, but I don't think they have a real prayer, because no college or university has the right to your tax money, to federal dollars. Certainly Columbia, which has tens of billions of dollars, or Harvard, which has $54 billion worth of endowment. They certainly don't have a right to take money from my pocket and your pocket. We should be giving them money to do medical research if it's needed, although I don't see why Harvard can't dip into its endowment. Why does it have to cut back on hiring and research? $54 billion, you know how much money that is? You know what the interest on that is on a daily basis? So the idea that Harvard can't afford to do research on medical and scientific and technology is an argument that doesn't sit well with a lot of people for whom $54 billion is unimaginable wealth. Also, Harvard attracts a great many very, very wealthy students, not only from the United States, but from Saudi Arabia and from other countries, and donors, some of whom have cut back on their funding of Harvard, including me. I've cut back on my funding of every university I've been associated with, Harvard, Yale, and Brooklyn College. I don't contribute to any of those schools anymore. I contributed to all of them. I did contribute all my papers to Brooklyn College. I can't take them back. And, I'm perfectly happy to have my papers in a library where people can have access to them, but they're not getting my dollars at this point. I'm not welcome to speak on any of those campuses about Israel, about President Trump, about civil liberties. They want one-sided speeches. There was an attempt to try to get me to debate a Professor Crispy at Harvard Law School who's very anti-Israel, and he refused to debate me. These people don't want to debate. They don't want dialogue. Harvard wouldn't allow the Lincoln Douglas debates if they were offered to them today. Half the students and faculty would say, we don't want to listen to Lincoln. He's wrong. We don't want to listen to Douglas. He's wrong. The people just want to listen to their own views. They don't want to listen to opposing points of view. What's happened to American education is just despicable. And you don't hear opposing points of view in class today. Teachers, instead of teaching students how to think, I was always the devil's advocate, always presenting points of view different from my own. Instead of devil's advocates today, what we have is just one-sided propaganda in many, many, many classrooms around the country. And people feel an obligation to propagandize their students, teaching them what to think rather than how to think. Not me. And that's why I think I'm happy that I retired from Harvard 11 years ago and continue to write. Just finished my 57th book, and my goal is 60. Let's see if I can make it. In any event, let's turn to some questions. We got some good questions. Okay, got a lot of questions disagreeing with me about my argument that if you allow clapping at a presidential speech, you have to allow booing as well. You can't allow one-sided shows of agreement without also allowing the other side to show disagreement. So several letters, I'll just read a couple of them. Disagree that you can permit clapping but not booing. Clapping preserves decorum. Booing destroys it. Next letter. Disapproval is simply refusal to clap. That is permitted. Booing is disruptive and excessive when other forms of ways of communicating disapproval are already built into normal allowed speech, attempting behaviors by our society. And then one of them disagreed with them and says, she likes the British system. And the British system, yes, we're very low key next to the British Parliament. I actually get a kick out of the Brits. Now, remember, the Brits do allow booing, but what they do is they require that it be done with decorum. So you can have decibel and time limitations. You can say, it's okay if you approve 20 seconds of that. If you disapprove, 20 seconds of boo, no. But you have to stop after 20 seconds. you can't be using your booing to prevent the speaker from going forward. So I'm sticking to my argument. I think booing is perfectly okay. If you have another way of showing it, if you want to have people hold up a sign that's a disapproval, okay, but you have to do that for the clapping too. And you can't say, well, clapping is spontaneous, but booing is planned and coordinated. No, that's not within the spirit of the First Amendment. If you can clap, you can boo, and if you can boo, you can clap. So I stick to my view. We should have the rules that they have in court. In court, a judge says, I'm about to render the verdict. You can't clap if you approve the verdict, and you can't boo if you disapprove. And if you do either of those, you'll be thrown out of the court. That's what rule I would apply as well. But my viewers disagree. I think every single letter I got on this disagreed with me. That's why I read it. Okay, this is a good one. But that was good too. This is a good one. I am no lawyer or scholar, but I thought foreign affairs was the exclusive purview of the executive. U.S. aid looks like a way for Congress to circumvent that rule. U.S. aid provides a way for Congress to interfere with executive foreign policy. I could have sworn that violated the Constitution. Where am I going wrong? Well, you are wrong. Administering foreign policy is primarily the job of the executive, but it's shared by Congress. Congress can declare war. President can't declare war. Congress has to approve of ambassadors. Ambassadors are part of foreign policy. The president can't make a treaty, foreign policy, unless he has 2/3 approval of the Senate. So it's a little simple to say that executive authority lies exclusively with the executive. No, it lies primarily with the executive, but Congress has a role to play. Okay, I got probably 50 letters correcting a typo. Instead of POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, I wrote POTUS, P-O-D-U-S. And they complain about that. Well, don't you understand? I'm from Brooklyn. President of the United States. President of the United States. So that's what I meant when I said POTUS. No, of course, it was just a typo. So I'll read this afterward to show that I'm not above criticism. So it really is outstanding how infrequently Mr. Dershowitz stumbles over his words with ums and errors. Okay, I appreciate that, but I do make spelling mistakes. I am the world's worst speller. I am so bad that I can't even Google words because I am so far away from how it's appropriately spelled that Google comes up with the wrong words, and I can't use spell check. I am the world's worst speller, maybe second worst speller. Thomas Jefferson was a terrible speller. In fact, he wrote an essay on it. And he said, it's not so important for men to spell well. It's very important for women to spell well. No, I don't agree with that. But speaking of sexism, of Jefferson's sexism, here's the most sexist letter I got. I have to read it. There should not be any women on the Supreme Court or in any other positions of power. They are too emotionally manipulated. This is from Curtis Bacon. Hey, they said the same thing about Jews. They said the same thing about Italians. They said the same thing about Catholics, about you name it. If you don't like somebody's points of view, you call them too emotional. No, women are not any more emotional than men. I know plenty of men who are emotional. Justice Alito's opinion was more emotional than the opinion written. You're right. 5 women constituted the majority, 4 women were part of the 5-person majority that overruled President Trump on the issue last week, but not because they were emotional. Come on, that's just sexism. Sorry. Related, the president needs a back channel to the Supreme Court. No, you don't have back panels to the Supreme Court. The president should never be allowed to speak to a Supreme Court justice about a pending case. It's happened. I can tell you that. I know from personal experience that there was a person who went to see Justice Hugo Black, a lobbyist, and he had helped Black get on the Supreme Court, and he tried to persuade Black to render a certain decision. And fortunately, Black threw the bum out of the office. And so you can't back channel the Supreme Court. That's a mistake. Here's another bigoted letter. No judge should hold office that is not born in the United States. Why not? Why shouldn't Felix Frankfurter have been a justice of the Supreme Court. He was born in Vienna. There have been other justices as well. Being born in the United States is only a qualification for being president. It should not be a qualification for being a judge. And I have to tell you, if I were writing the Constitution, I wouldn't make it a qualification for being president. You might want to say being in the United States for 20 years or 30 years, that's a relevant qualification. But whether you came here at age 6 months or whether you were born here should make no constitutional difference. Disagree with me? Disagree with me. We'll be back with a lot more disagreements and a lot more controversy tomorrow on The Dershow.